I'm just kind of the glue that holds all that together. And I just kind of work with all those various committees to understand what their goals and objectives are. And I just try to kind of implement whatever my board and those various committees needs to be done on a day-to-day basis so that the election officials can focus on their real jobs, which is being an election professional and not an association manager, or not having to manage committees or figure out if you're going to have chicken or beef at your conference. Those are details that they don't need to mess with, really. They can make the decision, and then we'll go implement it.
The full and free exercise of our sacred right and duty to vote is more important in the long run than the personal hopes or ambitions of any candidate for any office in the land.
You're listening to High Turnout Wide Margins, an insider's look at election administration hosted by Brianna Lennon and Eric Fay. Recently, the High Turnout Wide Margins team traveled to Portland, Oregon to attend a special workshop on state associations hosted by the Election Center. While there, we were able to have face-to-face conversations with people working in elections all across the country.
Welcome back to another exciting episode of High Turnout Wide Margins. This is one of your hosts, Brianna Lennon in Boone County, Missouri, and with me is
Eric Fay, Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri.
If you want to introduce yourself.
Aaron Ockerman, Executive Director, Ohio Association of Election Officials.
So our first question that we always ask people on the show is how you got involved in elections in the first place, and I know that you have a interesting story, but can you also talk a little bit about what it means to be the executive director of the Ohio Association?
Yeah, sure. Like most election officials, I fell into this through bad luck, I guess, right? So, I'm not an election official whatsoever. Probably we're at this conference and I'm surrounded by a bunch of election officials, and I'm not really one of you all, but I kind of am. I feel adopted. I started off, I'm a professional lobbyist. That's actually what I do on my day job. But I do have the great privilege of working with the Ohio Association of Election Officials, and I started lobbying for them back in 2001. And for 10 years, I was just their lobbyist, and I just did advocacy work for them, and then really got to know the great election officials in the state of Ohio. Became really passionate, not just about advocating for them, but also kind of helping them navigate some of the other difficulties that they were encountering as they wanted to grow their presence and just be more present for not just the legislature, but for the media and for their voters. And so that meant, re-looking at their conferences and their training programs and all the things that make a good association strong. And so they asked me at that point to become their executive director. This was right around 2011, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
So, Aaron, before we jump more into the association work itself, could you explain to the folks listening how election administration is structured in Ohio?
I don't know that we're unique, but I think we're pretty cool in the way we do it. We have 4 board members, so all 88 counties have 4 board members. There's 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. They are nominated by their local political parties. So the executive committees for both the Republicans and the Democrats nominate 2 individuals, and they send those names to the Secretary of State, who appoints those 4 board members. And then we have professional staff. Every county has at least a director and deputy director, Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, and then they build out a staff as they see necessary from there. But we're 100% bipartisan. So I was just in a committee hearing yesterday with the Franklin County Board of Elections. They have 52 individuals that work at that board. There are 26 R's and 26 D's, and that's the way we kind of split things up in Ohio, and that's how we're structured.
And is the director always of the same party as the governor, and the deputy the opposite party, or?
There used to be kind of this unwritten rule that whoever the Secretary of State was, if the Secretary of State was a Democrat, then the chair of the board would be a Democrat. That tradition's kind of gone by the wayside, but there is a law that says that whichever party the board chair is, the director has to be the opposite political party. So if you have a Democrat who chairs the board, you have a Republican that's the director of the Board of Elections, and we try to maintain the partisan balance that way.
How do you think that works for hiring people? Because if you've got people that are talented and trying to move around the state to maybe a larger jurisdiction but are blocked because they're not the right political party.
It happens. It's a challenge. There's no doubt about that. I've seen a handful of people who have switched parties over the years, and as long as the person who's hiring you is cool with that, then that's cool. But that doesn't always work out. And it's interesting, right? As you both know, having a county-based system, every board is unique, and some boards the political people that run those boards, or the partisan people that run those boards, really feel very strongly that they want a strong partisan person to direct or deputy direct their board. Others are like, they're just there to kind of run elections, and I don't need them to be involved in party stuff. And maybe they're a Democrat, but maybe they kind of are in the middle, and I just don't care. I want the person that's going to be the best to run the elections, and it just varies pretty significantly from county to county.
It is interesting how the political culture can change so much just within one state.
Within one from county to county,
yeah.
Really,
yeah.
Absolutely.
So in St. Louis County, we have a very similar structure, bipartisan election board. And when I started working there, one of the main things, in my opinion, holding us back, or administrative impediments we had, were that so many people who worked there were related to each other, and they were, kind of patronage hires, partisan hacks kind of thing. And frankly, in my opinion, did not serve us well. And myself and my counterpart director and our subsequent boards have tried very hard to change that. But I'm wondering if you've seen that dynamic anywhere in Ohio, and if so, has there been a movement away from it, or it's just hard thing to break sometimes?
Yeah, I'll name names. I'm not scared. I'll pick on Cuyahoga County and my friends up there, because I pick on them only because if you were to ask anyone in the 1980s or 1990s what board has the most challenges in the state of Ohio, it would have been Cuyahoga County, and they are one of the absolute best boards now. So I can say, that they have definitely evolved. But I always told people that in Cuyahoga County, the Board of Elections was the employer of first resort. So it's like you had someone who needed a job, you didn't know where to put them, stick them at the board. And that obviously has not, to your point, Eric, it just doesn't serve anyone well. And I really feel like we had that kind of watershed moment in 2000 where everything changed, and it went from being, this is a job you can kind of do in your sleep, and you got punch cards, and you've got paper-based voter registration systems, and now all of a sudden we're dealing with computers and technology, and we're under this microscope, and we're being scrutinized, and you just can't be a political hack and be in this job and be effective without putting a lot of things in jeopardy. And so we have absolutely evolved, professionalized. I mean, that's the whole point of this conference, really, is to talk about how we can continue to professionalize and train ourselves better. And we've absolutely seen that happen in the state of Ohio, not just in Cuyahoga County, but all across the state.
So moving from that question to the actual association in Ohio, I know this conference we're at, Aaron, is pretty much focused on election official associations. Ohio is one of the very few states that has an executive director for their association, and frankly was one of the models we used in Missouri to move to that executive director model. So can you explain to everybody kind of how your association is structured and how it functions, and why, and you mentioned a little bit, but why they moved to an executive director model?
Prior to 2000, in Ohio at least, our Secretary of State was actually the lobbyist for the local boards of elections, as well as the Secretary of State's office. And post-2000, there became a bit of a divergence in opinions on how legislation might move forward. And to their credit, at the time, our Secretary of State was Ken Blackwell, and his legislative director said, this is creating conflicts, candidly. I can't go in good faith and represent the viewpoints of local election officials and our Secretary of State at the same time. And so they pushed to hire a lobbyist. And that's how I got involved back in 2001. But we're structured that we have a board of trustees, a board of directors, just like many associations do. They obviously make all the decisions about the direction that the association goes. We have legislative committee. We have other various committees, subcommittees that help us do things like plan conferences and do our education courses and things like that. And I kind of say I'm just kind of the glue that holds all that together. And I just kind of work with all those various committees to understand what their goals and objectives are, and I just try to kind of implement whatever my board and those various committees needs to be done on a day-to-day basis so that the election officials can focus on their real jobs, which is being an election professional and not an association manager, or not having to manage committees or do all the, figure out if you're going to have chicken or beef at your conference. Those are details that they don't need to mess with, really. They can make the decision, and then we'll go implement it.
In that vein, too, how have you, if you have seen it change as we've had more turnover in the positions where people might not have a good baseline understanding anymore, they might be totally new to elections? Has the association stepped in for those? And maybe it already existed. We don't have a manual yet. But maybe Ohio does.
Yeah, we did recognize that problem pretty early on. I don't know about other states, but I feel like we all kind of took this turn, 2019, 2020, right? And obviously a lot of that was pandemic related and just pressure related. But we actually started to see it in Ohio maybe in 18 or 19, just a couple of years before I would say most people did. And so we actually went to our Secretary of State and had a conversation because we felt like they were in a good position as well. Again, they have that global viewpoint, right? And they have resources. So what can we do to try to either stem the tide or recognize that this is going to be a pattern and not a one-time thing? And so how can we prepare our election officials, our new election officials, better to do their jobs? So we created a really cool mentorship program that was actually another state, I think, mentioned that. Michigan maybe mentioned that in the last panel. And we're really proud of that. It's really cool. We work with the Secretary of State's office to figure out all the new people that are coming in to the association. We partner them up with a seasoned professional that's kind of lived in your shoes and done your job and can speak kind of truth into the life of those new people, not just about this is how you do X, Y, and Z function, but you're going to have to deal with this, that, and the other, and just be prepared, and here's some resources for you. And oh, by the way, if you need someone to go to the bar with you and cry in a beer with you, I'm your friend now. I'm your mentor and I'm your friend and I'm here for you. And so we've really worked very hard to kind of forge that. That's I think one really good example of what we've done in Ohio that I'm happy to hear other states are thinking about as well. And then we've really bolstered our continuing education program and our certification program. We partner with the Ohio State University and just have a really cool, and I'm super proud of the work that our education committee does on that. And I think that's a huge value for both election officials who have been around for a while and new election officials to be able to kind of get in there and get their hands dirty and get in some nitty gritty and do that separate and aside from the learning that they obviously do day in and day out.
Is that called OREO?
It's the OREO, yes.
Tell us about OREO.
Oh, thank you, Eric. I love talking about OREO, the Ohio Registered Election Official Program. Started back in, again, 2011. That was one of the reasons they wanted to bring me on as executive director, was to really kind of put this program together. It's evolved a lot in its most current iteration, which I think is a real winner. We partner, as I mentioned, with the Ohio State University. The thing I love, it's you have to go through 8 classes. There's 4 that are core classes that everybody has to take. You can take 4 elective classes. We've moved into this kind of new phase with Ohio State where we take advantage of the resources that this huge university brings to bear. And we have skills-based classes. So, and those can be, soft skills like computer skills or whatever, or they can be more emotional well-being and topics like that, or how to manage angry people or de-escalate. We literally have a training coming up at summer conference on de-escalation training and how to kind of walk people back from those tense situations. And we're going to dedicate time to that. But one of the things I think is super cool about it is from the very beginning, my board had this vision that these were going to be 3-hour classes. So they were going to be kind of manageable chunks, enough that you can really get in and get into substance. But, also, you didn't have to spend a week, which, again, not knocking the election center. There's tremendous value in coming out and spending time with your peers for a week and just immersing yourself in it. But these are designed to be a little bit different. But the cool part that I'm really beating around the bush, but I'm finally going to get to, is that we co-teach each class. So an hour and a half, roughly, is going to be taught by a professor from Ohio State, an actual professor. They're going to talk about the academics, the history, the law, whatever it might be. And then we have an election official, one of our own members, come in and teach the second half of the class. And they're going to say, all right, I know they just told you about the law and the history of it. Now here's how that really works. And so it's this very cool balance between kind of the academic and the practical, and we get feedback from our members all the time that they really, really love that. So we're super proud of it.
Hi, I'm Brianna Lennon, County Clerk for Boone County, Missouri, and you're listening to High Turnout Wide Margins, a podcast where we explore local election administration.
How do you, since you're in this unique position of being a lobbyist for the association and also the executive director, how does your time break down between those two tasks?
I always feel like I'm doing both. Like really, there's really not a time where I'm not feeling like I should be working on conference stuff or OREO stuff, and there's also not a time where I feel like the legislature ever gives us a break. Maybe not to answer your question directly, but my folks find it incredibly frustrating and sometimes infuriating that the legislature doesn't respect the elections calendar. Because they're around, they've been around. We were busy running the primary in March. They were in January and February, and they dropped 10 elections bills. And I'm sending them out to my legislative committee saying we need to be ready to respond to this because they're meeting and they're having hearings and they're gonna want our input, which is a good thing. But when they come to me, I can't say, well, we're busy running the election, we haven't had time to look at it, even though that's true. So it does create an interesting dynamic, Eric, where because of our legislative calendar, we are running elections and trying to juggle the ball of being proactive with our legislature, responsive to our legislature pretty much all the time.
Are there things that we should be doing differently in the elections community that you saw be successful in other areas that we might think we're too unique to do but may actually be very helpful?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think election officials tend to make the mistake of thinking that they should not be involved in advocacy, or they don't have a right to be in advocacy, or we're just here to administer the laws as the legislature gives them to us. So how dare us go and take a stand on a piece of legislation or whatever. And we have worked very hard in Ohio to go against that grain and say, no, we are the experts. In fact, our tagline is the Ohio Association of Election Officials, the elections professionals, because we want everyone to know that if you have a question, if you're a legislator and you think you have an idea about elections, you should be checking with us. And we will tell you this is a good idea or a bad idea, but more importantly, we'll explain to you how what you're proposing is going to impact the administration of elections and voters. And that is a huge win for everybody when election officials do that. It's a huge win for election administrators. It's a huge win for your voters. And it's a win for your legislators who are making informed decisions. They can't be an expert, despite the fact that they think they're an expert on elections. They can't be an expert in everything that they have to deal with. And so we have to step into that gap and be a provider of information to our policymakers if we expect anything good to happen. The other thing that I think I've seen that election officials, even when they get into the advocacy world, are hesitant to do is to take a proactive approach to legislation and say, you know what, it's not sufficient for us to just sit here and react to the whim of the legislature. We have ideas for how we can do things better. And gosh darn it, we're going to find someone in the legislature that's like-minded, and we're going to ask them to advance our causes as well. And we're going to get proactive. And oh, by the way, and this is me speaking as a lobbyist, sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And if you keep people busy working on the things you want them to work on, they don't have time to monkey around with you and muck things up. So those are two mistakes, Brianna, that I think I've seen the elections community around the country make, that I hope as we move these kinds of ideas forward about strong associations and getting involved in advocacy that we can rectify, because it breaks my heart when I see what's going on around the country and how the legislature is just kicking the tar out of local election officials. That's not right. It's not the way it should be.
I love that point because I know I don't love that, but I understand the necessity of it working with the legislature, because I do just prefer to administer the elections. I don't want to be, out in the front line, but it is what it is. So along in that vein, I don't know what the experience has been in Ohio, but it seems like in a number of states across the country where, and I'll just use Missouri as an example, where members of the legislature, whether they be for or against us, generally are very good about at least hearing us out, especially if we're being proactive. We have a lobbyist ourselves. But now there is, at least in our case, a small group of legislators that won't even listen, won't even hear us out on some of these issues that want to hand count ballots and these kinds of things. So I don't know if you have any insight into how to make inroads with those kind of folks or not.
It's tough, and we probably don't have time to unpack a full strategy for how to get to those folks. But I do think that that's where, you really need to understand the distinction between advocacy and education. And regardless if they're going to listen to your position on something, I think you still have an inherent responsibility to provide them with information. And it's, we always say if the legislature makes a bad decision and you have not provided them with information that would guide them in a different direction, then shame on you. Now, to the extent that a legislature wants to go in a direction, or legislator wants to go in a direction, and you've provided information and they make a bad decision anyway, then shame on them. But you can look yourself in the mirror at the end of the night and say, I did what I was obligated to do. I did everything that I could. I was straight, I was transparent. I was straightforward. I was honest. I provided information, and they went a different direction. And that's very frustrating. But I would say we tend to get myopic in the elections world sometimes and forget that, we're not the only one. The County Commissioners Association, they don't win every time they go to the legislature. The county engineers don't win every time. Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield doesn't win every time. Visa doesn't win every time. Nationwide Insurance doesn't win every time. That's just the nature of the legislative process, and that's not an excuse to stop going and doing your job just because you didn't get your way, I guess.
So every county in Ohio has a board of elections. That's relatively unique, but in most states, the election officials have other duties, at least in a good number of states. Maybe it's not most. And so the question I have for you is, in the very smallest counties, those small rural counties, how do they have the wherewithal to have an election-specific office and fund that and run it year-round?
I cannot tell you how much admiration I have for our small boards of elections. Obviously, there are some scale, issues. As you get bigger, your problems just get bigger. As you get smaller, you have less voters and less interactions and all that. But man, when you're doing it with two people, we have one county. It's a judge actually, they couldn't get enough funding from their commissioners to run their office. And so they sued, which they can do under Ohio law. And a judge ruled against the Board of Elections. And as a result, they have 2 part-time employees that are running now, how do you do that? That office, and that is where I think the association and the Secretary of State, we really got to stand in that gap. I mean, we have to do everything we can to prop those 2 ladies up and to give them every resource that they need, and to say if their commissioners aren't going to do it, or whatever, we are not going to let them fail. I don't know how a lot of our boards do it. I think the statistic in Ohio, at one point at least, and this may not be completely current, was that of our 88 counties, 44 of them had 4 employees or less. We're only doing elections. We're not doing we're not doing the BMV stuff or the DMV stuff or some of the. I think in Arizona they do absolutely everything in county government basically. So we don't have that problem. But just running an election is a lot, and a lot of our counties are doing it with very slim resources and even less people. So yeah.
No, we've had the conversation in Missouri a little bit that, especially in the very small rural counties, that the county clerks, they have so many duties that it's difficult for them to have enough bandwidth to perform the election duties. But then those counties are so under-resourced that they also cannot fund just an election-specific office. So, that it's a challenge, everywhere, I guess.
So in Ohio, our county boards of elections are one of only 3 entities at the local level, at least, that can sue their county commission for adequate funding. And that is not something we ever do lately, and it's very rarely used, but that is a pretty big stick in our back pocket that we do carry, and that does help from time to time in kind of getting people's attention. And look, all due respect to my county commissioner friends, they've got to fund police, and they've got to fund sheriffs, and they've got to build roads, and I'm sorry if your voting equipment is failing, but geez, I got to fix this bridge or people are going to die, right? So I don't. I'm not saying this to cast stones or whatever, but having that stick to be able to go to your commissioner and say, look, man, we are on a shoestring budget and we can't do this. We just can't do this. And if you don't want to go along with it, then I'll see you in court. That's again, not something we take lightly, but it's something that we do from time to time. We got to drive change from that local level, and driving change from the local level means speaking with one voice, and speaking with one voice means you have someone coordinating that voice and deciding what's important, and that's where your associations come in. And so, again, really proud of the work we've done in Ohio, but I do think that it's worth local election officials' time in every state to give serious consideration and spend a little time thinking about, how can I strengthen my association? How can I get proactive in the legislature? How can I up my game when it comes to training? How can I put on great conferences where people come and they learn from each other and they share best practices? And yes, they go to the bar at 6 o'clock at night and they just cry in each other's beers and hug each other, because that is such a big part of what has happened to us over the last 4 years. There's just so much inherent value in all of that stuff, and it doesn't happen in the way it should if your association isn't engaged in helping you do it. And it never will be, because that's not your job. Your job is to run elections, and it seems secondary, but I just think it's so fundamental too. It's you got to run elections, but you got to walk and chew bubble gum too. Someone in your association should step up. Someone in your state should step up and really say, this is going to be a priority for us. So we're going to make it happen. And if you have the resources and you can hire someone like me, either part-time or full-time, I just think there's value in that too, because the bad thing about when you're all volunteers, the bad thing about firing a volunteer is they probably want to get fired. They're happy to be relieved of their obligations, but when you pay somebody, it takes on a whole new level of accountability. And so to the extent that you can get someone who's willing to kind of step in and help you and be responsible and take the initiative to make sure things get done, it's just a good way to move things along.
You've been listening to High Turnout Wide Margins, a podcast that explores local elections administration. I'm your host, Brianna Lennon, alongside Eric Fay. A big thanks to KBIA and the Election Center for making this podcast possible. Our managing editor is Rebecca Smith, managing producer is Aaron Hay, our associate producer is Katie Quinn, and our digital producer is Mark Johnson. This has been High Turnout Wide Margins. Thanks for listening.